Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining this particular session on peace in Islam. And obviously a very big topic, a very important topic. And just to start with this beautiful reference from the Quran that we are all created and in respect to Islam's teachings as a single unit, and that we are to live in peace. And I guess that's the hope of all of us, regardless of our faith perspective. And on that note, I'd just like to start by today acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the lands on which we gather. Presumably we might be all around the state. And in the spirit of all the wonderful things that are happening at the moment, celebrate and commit ourselves to this process of reconciliation and acknowledging the sentiment of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, a voice for our Indigenous peoples from across this beautiful country. So joining with all the religious leaders who've just together supported the constitutional referendum on an Indigenous voice, I think this is just such a wonderful statement for our country. And obviously it's a great example for you to use for religion in Australia post 45, but more than that, it acknowledges together our respect for elders past, present and emerging, and a reminder to all of us that we might learn to walk as gently on this land and with each other as our traditional custodians do. And so this is the intentions for this session. My apologies, it's pre-recorded, but I have a prior commitment tomorrow. So we want to really go back and just solidify our understanding what the syllabus was really asking of us, to really focus on sacred texts and writings. And it's not just for Islam, but it's for every aspect of the course, of course. And to look at a few examples of the lived expression of Islam. And in all areas of religion and peace and the religious tradition studies, this is probably the area that is sometimes the weakest, that students might be able to quote generic teachings and so forth, but then taking the leap from a text, maybe what it's teaching, and then showing what it could look like in the lived expression of people is always a bit harder. So we're going to try and cover some of that and provide some links for further case studies that you may enhance, your delivery for HSC. And then at the end of this, I won't be referring to it today, I've put on material that I could not quite see on the Sydney Catholic Schools website from something I did last year. And so I've just added that material at the end of this PowerPoint. So when it goes up on the site, you'll have access to that as well. It's got some more examples. And of course, it's always how you might. It's not a definitive. You can always improve the samples that are provided. So here we go. Back at the syllabus. And I think the most important thing is if you look at the religion and peace component of the syllabus, the first thing it challenges you to do is to really investigate, inquire, ponder, get engaged with the significant writings within sacred texts. And often the questions at HSC and the trials will refer to that part of the syllabus, significant writings. That means particular really important passages from the sacred texts, and then how they can inform the teachings of the religious traditions. And obviously in Islam, it's from both the Quran and Hadith. It only says to outline the principal teachings, because once you start looking at principal teachings, of course, they're multitudinous, and one leads to the other and so forth. So it says to outline them, because ultimately we're going back to sacred texts and the richness of the messages they have for, in this instance, for Muslim adherents. Then it says demonstrate, and demonstrate is show by example. And that means specifics, right? How, in this instance, religion may guide Muslims to achieve this concept of inner peace, or rather maybe a nicer way of saying it, and probably if we had the chance to rewrite the syllabus, we might be talking more about personal peace, just a sense of personal peace. And then to look at this concept of, again, through by example, of Islam and what does it do in respect to world peace. And there's a whole lot of complexities around that we might try and grapple with a little bit differently today. So always starting with sacred texts in every aspect, but the syllabus makes it very clear how important that is for, in this instance, Islam and whatever your other tradition is. So when you go back and start to look at the questions, last year was quite really open. It left students able to talk about really any aspect that they were interested or felt capable of doing. If it says at least one religious tradition, it really is all you have to do. Some kids think, oh, but if I do two, they might really be looking for two. If they say at least one, that's all you have to do. If you're really confident in one religious tradition, and if you think you could answer a question like that very well in terms of both personal and communal peace, then it's fine to do one religious tradition. But if you feel a little daunted by the question and whatnot, then obviously use two. You'll see, as I was referring to just a minute ago, 2020 actually used that concept from the syllabus directly. Significant writings within sacred text encourage peace and harmony. They don't automatically mean it's going to happen. We all know that peace is a very complex issue. So, you can go back through those, but I do always like to have a little look at 2018 when it was two religious traditions. And for whatever your religious traditions, obviously there were texts for the other traditions as well, you had to use the specific text that was provided, plus others of your own database, of course. So again, but it was talking about sacred texts. So I implore you to work very strongly or spend a lot of time developing how you can write about your sacred texts for religion and peace, because it really hangs on your ability to do this. So, a lot of you would have seen this before. So sacred texts, what do they teach? And then what does it look like? So that should demonstrate by example in the religious traditions. So let's see what we can come up with. A reminder again, some of you would have seen me use this before. It's got the nice little link to a really good video. But obviously there is no aspect of Islam that you can talk about without talking about faithful and committed submission to the greater jihad, the overcoming of the ego. So that's absolutely critical. That's part of the peace response. So this concept of inner peace that kids still write about once a person has inner peace, etc. Inner peace is a journey. Personal peace is a journey, and it's a bit like a roller coaster or waves. And so I just love you to think about it in this way, that how can faith sustain adherence, particularly in complex or critical times in life? So how does it sometimes just give people inner strength and communities, individuals and communities, to keep going, to maintain hope in challenging situations? Think about it that way rather than I've got you, now I'm going to go and conquer the issues of the world. So I'd like to start today with something a little bit different. Many of you who've been around studies of religion will remember Zulaya from when she commenced, or she was a co-founder of ISRA in Sydney. And of course, she's been working now in Melbourne for many years. And Zulaya in 2015 completed her PhD in the attainment of inner peace in Islam. And I don't think we've really tapped into that as a studies of religion community, when it's a wealth of wisdom for us to draw on for this particular topic. And so in the slide, when you get the slides, there's links to a couple of YouTube clips. This is one of them. And then down the bottom of this screen, there is actually a link to Zulaya's PhD, which is obviously a very complex document that you may not have time to read, but I'm going to try and give you a few snapshots of it in this presentation. There's another really beautiful video. This was from an American 4-day spiritual retreat, and I think it was over what we would call Christmas period last year or the one before, and it's a beautiful reflection from Zulaya in terms of her topic there. You know, in a world where there is a lot of turmoil, how as a Muslim can you maintain this sense of inner peace? So either one of those videos would be really helpful, I think, to take your understanding of inner peace in Islam to a whole new perspective. And I do thank Zulaya for sharing information with me in terms of this preparation for today. She's very generous as always. Throughout her PhD and in the presentations that Zulaya does, she mentions the 99 names of Allah as being a particular place for Muslims to go and to reflect on their relationship with God, their knowledge and understanding of God, and how this strengthens their ability to maintain a sense of inner peace in the daily, you know, ups and downs of life. And I would really encourage our students to have a couple of the names that they can refer to illustrate that they have had this deeper engagement with Islam, particularly if they are not Muslims themselves, that would really enhance what they're talking about. But more than that, help them to understand the faith a little more. So there is that there, and there's a little link to it when you get the PowerPoint. Of course, I often say to students, and we all know under exam conditions, it's very easy to forget things. I'm sure I would if I was a kid. And obviously the Bismillah, which starts all except one chapter of the Quran, is a beautiful reminder for Muslims, and I think of all people of faith, that God is most gracious and most merciful. So if students perhaps forget some of the other names and so forth, to remember that the Bismillah is a continuous call to Muslims in all that they do, in all of their prayers, in all of their engagement with the Quran, that God is gracious and merciful, and thus Muslims are to model these values in their daily lives and in their peacemaking, and that is with self and with others. So that's something for students to keep in mind as well. So what I've done is I've put together some quotes from Zulaya's PhD, and they hopefully provide a little database that your students might be able to tap into to elevate their writing, because I think doing this sort of, introducing this sort of academic research and then illustrating it with some examples of Islam in practice will really elevate a response from very generalist answers that we can get, such as, you know, Muslims pray 5 times a day and that way they find inner peace. We've got to go further than that. So I think there's a lot of things here, but the thing I'd like to highlight first that I really learnt from Zulaya's PhD is that obviously for any aspect of peace in Islam, unless one has belief in God, then the rest won't follow. It's the non-negotiable basis for this development of peace. And obviously belief can come in different ways and different shapes, and it grows with time, etc. But the whole foundation of this quest and gaining of some sense of inner or personal peace has to be grounded in belief in God. So that's a non-negotiable. Zulaya is very realistic in her own life as a wife, a mum, an academic, and all else, that inner peace, having it, doesn't mean you're not going to be sad, that you're not going to be suffer loss and all of those other very human things that happen. But that, as she says in her PhD, that it can become, even in complex times, bearable and even meaningful, that in suffering there can be meaning. The other thing, obviously, as I mentioned just earlier, that Islam is, of course, submitting oneself to God. So it has to be a relationship of absolute trust. So all of these are sort of the non-negotiable boundaries of this quest for inner peace that she's exploring in her PhD. So there are a few things to think about there. So then it goes on, and of course, she mentions, as I said, repeatedly the names of God, and she gives some examples here and links them there to the Quran. And I think it shows us how important this is to the journey to peace. So it's no good for the kids just to say, Muslims repeat the names of Allah and find peace. They have to do something with it. They have to take it further. But certainly, I think a reference from Zulaya would be very beneficial there. This part here is, again, stressed in her work. So when I said before, students often present for peace saying, Muslims pray 5 times a day and they find inner peace, full stop. This is a way of taking it much further. And so there's a couple of examples here of how Prophet Muhammad, he would then say the additional prayer, which is hadith, and Muslims should in their prayer seek this state of peace from God. And the other thing that I learned and I really found very beautiful is that at every prayer, before he concluded, Muhammad would look to his right and his left and wish peace upon those standing with him. And so this concept, as Zulaya expresses it, of spreading peace and encouraging others to attain inner peace is a direct outcome of such hadith. I think that's a really important point, and we're going to try and use that in an example later on. This phrase here, I think this is an absolutely fabulous phrase that Zulaya uses throughout her PhD, that all of this quest for inner peace and quest for submission and overcoming ego, etc., in a Muslim's life is about having a Tawhid-centric worldview, God-centric worldview. So, and she goes on there to talk about how even events such as natural disasters and illness, referred to via the 99 names, are times when this peace can come about. So I think that phrase is a really, really important one, that it would be excellent for students to consider what it means, and then certainly to be using that, because without that, probably inner peace at the level that Zulaya is talking about is somewhat more complex to achieve. The next part here outlines the 3 steps that she believes are steps towards inner peace. And that the first thing, of course, is the belief and knowledge of God. Okay. And obviously referenced through to the Quran. So in a Muslim worldview, that having that belief and that knowledge of God, for example, through the 99 names, provides you with the pathway to peace. And then beyond that is the relationship of knowing God and knowing oneself. So it all starts and then it leads. And then the next step, and I mean, this isn't just you do this, then you do that, then you do that, and then it's all done. This is an ongoing evolution. But is to see God and beauty in everything, regardless of the results. So because the belief, and again, this is the heart of submission, that God has created, as the Quran says, everything in the best way. So those things are a very succinct summary of the stages of coming to a sense of inner peace, informed by this Tawhid-centric worldview that Zulaya discusses. And she also adds some beautiful concepts here that would be excellent for students to reference in their peace essays. So contentment, serenity, peace, and positive opinion, which is a really interesting one, to have a positive opinion, a positive worldview, even to have that in life's complexities. So that's a little snapshot of some of the things that Zulaya outlines in her 270-something page amazing PhD. So just going to add in a couple of other little examples and see if we can somehow put this together into a little response. So one of the great things that Israel has done is they've introduced the first Muslim clinical pastoral education course in Australia, Islamic chaplaincy. Now, clinical pastoral education, it says there, that's from the Israel website, is to provide pastoral support and in institutionalized settings. So hospitals, aged care, they come straight to mind. So those types of settings. And, you know, if you're doing bioethics for Islam and you're examining the voluntary assisted dying legislation that's been put into place now in all states, really, except the territories in Australia, this would be an excellent thing to add to your bioethics, because it's one way you could show, well, Islam opposes voluntary assisted dying. It absolutely supports the accompaniment of those who are ill in a spiritual manner. That's holistic care of the person, and that's what clinical pastoral care does. And you'll see there from the Israel website, a theology of caring, grief, and loss. Okay, and those are the sorts of things in Zulaya's PhD about those complex times, those times of suffering in life and so forth. So we'll see if we can use this. Many of you would study Ghazali, and so you might think, well, what's he doing here? So I know at marking Ghazali, you mainly just get his impact on Sufism, but his impact is far greater, actually, particularly on education. So if you study Ghazali, this is another little snapshot that you can double dip, you know, minimize your content, maximize your application for religion and peace, as well as for himself. So in 2020, November 2020, so this university from Malaysia published this research, which was about stress therapy according to Al-Ghazali. So looking at people suffering from anxiety and all kinds of stress-related issues and so forth, obviously looking at Muslims suffering from those things. So this is a link to the research, but I've added little snippets into this presentation, which you really, if you wanted to, you go look at the research. But it's a very interesting thing that the work of Al-Ghazali has been taken by psychologists and analysed in respect to treatment of patients suffering from those types of things. So it looks at the causes of stress, and obviously, again, from a Muslim perspective, this will only be a process that will have benefit for a person if they have that relationship with God, if they have that Tawhid-centric worldview. It talks about fana, and this is what it is. It is a Sufism concept. And to pass away, it doesn't mean to die, but to pass away from the old, to annihilate the old self in a positive way. So, and coming to that connection with God and creation and self bringing that to connection. So this was Al-Ghazali's teaching. So what they did is, and it's very similar to some of the things that Zulaya is saying, that they obviously, this remembrance of God, it all starts with focusing on remembrance of God, the names of Allah. And again, remembering that God, God's will, God knows best, and so on. And then this cycle, which they tracked, again, obviously for Muslims who have a faith commitment. And then there's a little summary from the research report that says it can be, the feeling of stress can be in the life of the individual can be eliminated from the heart if there is another conscious memory that is stronger and becomes the focus. So the idea of this therapy is that God becomes the focus. Okay, the focus on God overcomes the memories related to anxiety and stress. And so the Fana theory is to be able to relieve and also eliminate the feeling of stress experienced by individuals when these techniques can be grasped perfectly. So again, it's a process, but it's an interesting study. I just thought I'd also make a little reference to something that's quite local here in Sydney, and that some of you may be using in other aspects of your work, Muslim Women Australia. And Maha Abdo, who has an Order of Australia, is quite a remarkable woman. This is what she says about how everyone has it in their hearts to make a difference, but she focuses on how faith can be empowering, especially in culturally diverse communities. And so I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Muslim Women Australia, but they do incredible things to support women and children in abusive situations. They do incredible work towards overcoming and helping people come to grips with the impact of domestic violence, including helping men to understand better, etc. So they do some incredible work, but Maha, she really certainly emphasizes again that faith can be such a critical component, and certainly her work is inspired, and the work of all who are Muslim Women Australia are inspired by their faith. As an aside, you may have noticed the pink Quran, okay, when Ed Husnik was sworn in to the new ministry, and it was Maha that sent it to him, and that little bit that's on the screen, it's about her having done that. So it's a great time we're living in. So we've got Ghazali, we've got Zulaya, we've got Muslim women, and we've got a research paper on stress management, basically. What could we do with that? As always, it's just a suggestion to sort of get you thinking what's possible. Sky's the limit, really. So how would you possibly introduce this? Well, you need to, as always, you need to give a context, because I guess if you're a younger marker, you may not know who Zulaya is. So her 2015 PhD thesis, etc., etc. So she stressed connection, submission, peace, and teachings defined. And then this concept of the Tawhid-centric worldview. And this is a little quote from her, that it sustains inner peace, born of faith where the believer faces adversity without anxiety or despair. So much of the Zulaya's work is drawn from the work of Sayyid Nursi. So you need to mention that. Now, in here, I have outlined the 3 stages with a connection to the Quranic reference that they come from. You know, it might be a bit much for students to do that, but at least you can see here what is possible. Okay, so I think for most markers, this would be certainly a new insight into how Muslims understand this development of inner peace. And obviously submission is so critical. So then it goes on to talk about a little bit about what she says about surrender, etc. And then goes on to that part about the 5 daily prayers. Now, you know, we're trying to take an extraordinary PhD and condense this into year 12. This is one little part of their study. So we're trying to bring it down to the basics and make it manageable for students, and also to manageable for the markers, and stay true to our syllabus that says we have to demonstrate via example. So we link then to what Zulaya has said about Prophet Muhammad turning to his left and to his right, right and left, and wishing peace, which is obviously hadith. Now, I've just put in here in the different colors those 2 examples, just to show you it is possible to do it. You can probably do it in better ways, other ways, but this is just a sample. So a practical expression of this necessity of sharing peace is the Muslim chaplaincy program, the clinical pastoral education, and taken from the ISRA site, really, Islamic theology in respect to caregiving, grief and loss, to support those who are ill or vulnerable to maintain the Tawhid-centric belief that can sustain their sense of peace. So it's sort of showing a practical example of what this might look like for Muslims. And then you've got the programs organised by Muslim Women Australia. You don't need to do both, but it's just giving you some options. So one of their great programs that they run, so you always got to drill it down to show the practicalities. So their Saving Grace program, which is about overcoming domestic violence, the lived expression of submission, to bring about both personal and communal peace. And it's absolutely fine to use those terms, because no one person or organisation is ever going to bring about this thing called world peace. Well, maybe not in my lifetime anyway. So that's just a little snapshot of how you might be able to do that. Just then towards the end, she refers to Ghazali. So you might just want to do the Ghazali thing. You wouldn't do it all, but it's just examples. So Ghazali said this, I think it's an absolutely beautiful reference from him. True knowledge is only unveiled through learning what is engraved on the well-guarded tablet, the Quran. And so his own life, Sufism, peace, etc. And there's your link to the sacred text, that only in Allah will hearts find peace. So then you go and do the little link between Ghazali, and there's just that one sentence there on the research, okay? So exploring stress relief according to the spiritual field. So, you know, you can just do it that way, and it will just add that extra little dimension to your response. So in this, research has found that focusing all thoughts, so that it ties back to Zulaya, okay, all thoughts on God assisted Muslims to move from anxiety and stress towards peace through full and unconditional submission. So the researchers found in a different format the same conclusion that Zulaya found. So I think it's a much richer understanding of inner peace than perhaps we've always managed to have, and hopefully this will be helpful to you. So moving forward a little bit. Okay, so the beautiful passage again from chapter 49 of the Quran, this beautiful concept of having been created from the single pair, all of humanity. And I guess the most important part of this, well, for this particular focus of the study, is that the belief that human beings were created to know and not despise each other. And just a reminder for students, when you're reading texts from other languages, they'll have things in brackets just to ensure that translation makes sense, okay? So the things that are in brackets are just additional ways of expressing in the translation, but it's absolutely pivotal text for religion and peace, this one. So this is again a little bit different, because I'm often asked is, can we talk about terrorism? And you sort of think, well, it depends on how you talk about terrorism. And I guess people get a bit scared to approach it. And yet it's a fact of contemporary life. And mostly for Muslims, it's a fact of contemporary life. It's a really hard fact for them because Muslims are the ones that bear the full brunt of terrorism in one way, shape, or form. And that sadly and tragically is increasing attacks against them. And we saw that with Christchurch when it was one of our own who went there and just, with no rhyme or reason, murdered innocent people at prayer. So nobody knows more than the Muslim community here and around the world the impact of terrorism. So this was a report from The Hague. It was 2017, and there are other reports available. And it talks about moderate Muslims resisting terrorism. And in part, it's sort of, it's a hard way to describe, but in part, it sort of says that, Muslims maybe could do more. And yet at the same time, it says Muslims are doing a lot. It does both. And I think it's really important for our students, in the spirit of the syllabus, to be understanding of what it is like for so many Muslims around the world to be facing so many issues where they are targeted because of their faith. So we're going to have a little look at the fatwa. I think students do need a fatwa. I think that's a great way of addressing this complex issue where they can show by example that without doubt the absolute majority of Muslims are opposed to any form of violence because their faith is about peace. And so we need to help students understand that themselves, and we need to help them be able to express that, certainly for the exam, but beyond that in the communities they belong to as life goes on. So this was another research, and this was subsequent to the Christchurch attacks. This is an image from Christchurch here. And that the majority of victims of terrorists are Muslim, without a doubt, whether that be in an incident like this, with incidents in Europe, with incidents in the States, and certainly with attacks on Muslim communities by fellow Muslims in parts of Africa, wherever. So it's something to bear in mind. One of the interesting things, well, it's not interesting, it's sad actually, and this is from an American perspective, that any attack committed by a Muslim or Muslim perpetrators gets 357% more media coverage than an attack committed perhaps by a white supremacist against a Muslim community. 357% more media coverage. And in my own research, some time ago now for the Churchill Fellowship, that was exactly the same here. That the media coverage is so skewed to be against Islam that it's really quite horrendous in this day and age. So what have we got? I think it's really important, if you haven't already, to take a look at the Islamophobia report, the third one that was released this year, and analysed, it says on screen, 247 verified incidents that occurred. So published this year, and I would really urge you to take a deeper plunge into this. The link will be in the PowerPoint when you get it. And I am going to show you just a couple of cases that were investigated, and they are ugly. So I apologise for the language and the ugliness, but I think it's something we all need to be conscious of. And you keep asking yourself, well, how as a Muslim, particularly a Muslim woman who is in hijab, what might this be doing to your personal peace, even in a country like Australia? So here we go. So the first one, case 16, the Bible dead set says anyone who doesn't believe in Allah, doesn't follow your faith, is to be tortured, raped and killed by Allah's people, Muslims. F them. They should have been at work, not praying in the middle of a day for 3 hours every day. Do you know the Aussie government pays for them, etc. And then the other one, case 31, which is just, it's almost unspeakable, that saying that the Christchurch shootings, the shooter should have had been more far-sighted and taken out an Islamic faith primary school. These are Australians talking about our fellow citizens. So grappling with this concept of peace, what does that do if you are confronted with these attitudes? And I think it's something worth considering to look at how these teachings in regard to peace may sustain Muslims in light of this sort of barrage that they're often being approached with. So if we go back to that first report, so this is that case study of a fatwa being issued against ISIS. So there are many such fatwas. The Indonesian clerics did something similar. So you don't have to use this or that, but students, I think, should have a fatwa that they can say Muslims themselves are on the receiving end of most terrorist violence, and they continually condemn it. This is one example. So this was a huge Sufi religious festival, 1.5 million people. And so they, what they did was they organised, not just for the clerics to sign, but they organised for a significant petition to be signed against terrorist attacks. So, and they tried to get all the people attending the religious festival to sign the petition, and they were, distributing flyers, etc., etc. So this is a really significant example of Muslims themselves standing together based on their faith, and challenging media organisations to stop calling groups such as ISIS, etc., Islamic, because they are not seen to be faithful to Islam. Obviously, they aren't. Out of that same study, there came this amazing story of this beautiful young woman. She was 19 at the time. This is 2017. She was in the States in her first year, I think it was, of university, studying history. And she was learning about the Crusades, or they were studying the Crusades, and someone in the class started to go on a rant, a really horrible rant about Islam and Muslims. So she could have just slid away and hid, but she didn't. She got proactive. And so, as it says there in the statement on the screen, she wanted to show people how weak the argument is. And so what she did was she put together the 712-page document of all the examples she could find of people, Muslims, fighting against terrorism. And I just thought, wow, that is such an inspiring story of a young person working in her own way to speak out on behalf of all Muslims, to say we are people of peace, and I've got the proof to show you. I think she would be an absolutely wonderful example to continue and to develop a response about. And you can, the link to that document there is there once you get the PowerPoint, and it just goes on and on and on and on and on, and all from all around the world. And as she says up there in the yellow part on screen, she the list isn't comprehensive because she only wanted to use things that she could find on English websites. So it's, I think, an exceptional example that could be developed into something really special for HSC, and maybe inspire our young people when they encounter a difficulty to do something with it as well. There's other things, I won't go through this. That's just another site that has a whole range of global condemnations of Islamic terrorist groups. So I think when you're talking about Islam and world or communal peace, the absolute total commitment of Muslims to condemning violence in the name of God and the name of their faith is something that would be really valuable for you to make a little case study for HSC, if you haven't already done so. So it's certainly one way of addressing the issue, which is can be the elephant in the room. And I think we really have to engage our kids in seeing this material, that it is Muslims that are most impacted, and it is Muslims who are doing, by and large, everything they can personally and communally to work to in whatever way possible to condemn the violence. This is something that's happening right now as we speak in India, which you probably would be aware of. So we're always looking for ways to make connections and ways to keep it contemporary. So you may have heard how a couple of politicians, Hindu politicians in India, made derogatory comments about the Prophet, and which led to some protests by Muslims, and then ultimately caused people were injured on both sides of the argument. But what happened next? These are both stories from the BBC last Friday, the 17th of June. So what happened was the police arrested quite a number of the people who they claimed were at the protests, and some say they weren't, but they arrested them anyway. And there's video emerged of them absolutely beating them so brutally. Not only did they do that, they then went and bulldozed some of their homes, and that's the picture there that shows you that. So in light of that, what's that got to do with peace? Well, what happened was that Islamic leaders in India had then went and called for peace and no more protests, drawing on their faith. And it's all around Friday prayer. So what they were worried was that there would be more protests, and it would impinge on Friday prayer. That would be the time for the gathering. And they, of course, said Friday prayer, there should be no protests at all, but Friday prayer is obviously not the time. So this is a little piece from the chairman of the ICI, and I'm just going to call him Mr. Mahali because he has a 5-word name and it's very long, and etc. But so he and other leaders talked about the centrality of Friday prayer. So if you study Friday prayer for your practice in Islam, this would be a great further example that you could use across both areas of study, okay? So he called on Muslims to remember what Friday prayer is, and to do so in remembrance of the Prophet and his example. Okay, so I think, and down the there's Prophet Muhammad always carried the message of peace, love, compassion, humility. We should take this message forward. Now, it's really hard because this issue is one of culture as well as religion. It's probably more culture. And in India, Islam is the 13% minority group. And there is in India a rising sense of nationalism, similar to the Christian nationalism that's rising in America and parts of Europe and so forth. So it's complex. It's a complex one. So this is how you might be able to, always a might, be able to write about this. Okay, so the complexities that can arise in applying the teachings that human beings were made, and there's your reference to sacred text, to know and not despise each other. You don't need to try and remember that whole long passage, but that's essential for this. And then evidenced in India during 2022. Now, this story will keep developing, no doubt, but obviously for HSC markers to see something recent and where it shows evidence of actually engaging with the living expression of religion is a good thing. Then you've got the derogatory comments about Prophet Muhammad. There were public protests and injuries on both sides, arrests and so forth. In the midst of such cultural tensions, I think you ought to make that connection. Religious leaders then reflect the striving for submission that is inherent in Islam. You've always got to come back to that because this is what they are doing. And then you've got the call of the chairman, Mr. Mahali, to gather peacefully, to pray, to hear the sermon and disperse, following the example of the Prophet. And then he gives, that's that little quote from him. Then it goes on, Friday prayer is a time for communal harmony, not just for the Muslim community, but he also said for society, okay? It's indicative of how Islam can guide adherents to live a life in peace. This is last year's HSC question, even in the most complex cultural circumstances. So I know with Friday prayer, just like all the other practices, sometimes it's hard to show the impact on individuals and communities. But this is a way of doing that for both your depth study and also here, of showing just how holding onto the faith can make a difference in complex circumstances. So something else that I thought might be useful for you to investigate is the Muslim Council of Elders. So you've got it here that it was formed in 2014, okay, and it's scholars, etc. But it's about justice, wisdom, justice, independence, and moderateness. All of those things that counter that minority extremism that gets all the media attention. So we're trying to defocus that. So, okay, it goes on and explains it. It has some amazing initiatives that obviously you can explore, but looking at ways of resolving tensions, protecting young Muslims. I know there are lots of projects here in Australia from Muslim communities such as Israel to work with young Muslims to help them understand the truth and the beauty of their faith, whereas we know that online, not just for many, many kids of all faiths and none, some of the material that comes up online can be the opposite of the true ideals and values of not just a religious tradition, but a society as a whole. And so to really clarify the teachings of Islam, particularly in respect to harmony in society between peoples of all faiths and none, okay? So I guess one of the things that is really significant is that it refers to this wonderful thing called the Document on Human Fraternity that was first issued on the 4th of February in 2019 and has grown on to be an international point of connection, not just for religious communities, but beyond that, and the challenge to overcome difference and to see the shared things that we have. And so I think it's, hopefully you've been using the Document on Human Fraternity, but for 2022, you need to take it further. So just for those who may not know about the document, so it was signed there by the Pope and the Grand Imam, and it was quite revolutionary and quite controversial because I know certainly Pope Francis was condemned for statements such as that are on the screen by members of the Catholic Communion. So it's a very, very focused on looking at human nature, humanity and its breadth, and seeing that each person is respected in their own right, their own dignity, and is free to practice their faith, etc. So just a possible way of doing it, and this is that question that was, religion can be a motivation for peace. So teachings defined in Bible, Quran, teachings of Jesus, Sunnah of Muhammad, etc., integral to both faiths. So it goes on throughout history, etc. Both traditions have been motivators for peace, as evidenced in the groundbreaking 2019 Document on Human Fraternity, introduced by. While each faith is unique, remember we're never comparing religious traditions in studies of religion, so they're both unique. However, in this instance, their teachings concerning peace-seeking and peace-making, those two elements, in the name of God, reflect shared values, justice, forgiveness, reconciliation, and so much more. These can support adherence to find personal peace and then whoever you might be using or whatever you might be using. But you always have to have, I think, that little overrider. This potential to motivate peace is often realised. The extent to which it's universal, it is difficult to quantify. Okay, because as I said, even Pope Francis cops a lot of flack for these sorts of things, I suppose. So I think, but it is a great, if you're doing, most schools seem to do Christianity and Islam, that's certainly the highest number. It's a great document to bring the two together and then launch out and do some different things with it. I said that the document on human fraternity has had some interesting flow-on effects. So East Timor, a little country that's known such pain, their newly elected president, this is May this year, they've adopted the document on human fraternity. Now, this is a very Christian, very Catholic country, to be implemented as a way forward for the country, to find this balance and to find this peacemaking, peacekeeping and social harmony. They're going to use the document on human fraternity. And of course, a little earlier this year, President Biden joined the Pope and the Imam to call for human fraternity. So that was quite a statement, I suppose, that the US, at least at one level, got involved. I'm sure others might not have been so happy with President Biden doing that, but it's a great statement. I just included towards the end of this, this was the winner of the Fraternity Prize last year. And you could explore using the fraternity winners. So each year now they give a prize, the Fraternity Prize, to, last year it was this lady, and it was the UN Secretary General, I think, last year, for how they are exhibiting the values of fraternity. And again, it's a great story if you haven't read the story of how this mum, her son in the French military, was gunned down by another Muslim who thought he was killing a French person of non-Muslim descent, etc. And how Latifa turned that around into a movement for peace. And so an education of young people for living in social harmony. It's a fabulous story. So there's all the information is there, and there's a way that you could write about it, just as a little example of how you could write about what she did. So it's the Zayed Award for Human Fraternity. That's now given every year on the anniversary of the document of fraternity. So hopefully that will be beneficial to you. Goes on. Yet again, as always, I remind you, the only way to get this stuff embedded in your minds is to keep writing it and not make too many notes, just keep writing practice. But at this stage, because obviously we're not live, I can't take questions, but I've included from this point on some additional material. This, of course, is Christchurch, that you may not have had access to before. Certainly this story is absolutely a remarkable story of forgiveness in the spirit of the Quran, the Hadith. Farid Ahmed, whose wife was killed in the mosque shooting, and his story, and then the Christchurch survivors who were able to go on Hajj, etc., and how that helped them. So if you're doing Hajj as your practice, you could use that, etc. So there's a whole lot of stuff here. This was on Ramadan, etc., in lockdown. And Heather Fagan, of course, who we all know and love through ISRA, a little bit about her story. And then there's a couple of insights from Heather on how her faith and how reflecting on the Quran, the Hadith, guides her and it helps her attain inner peace in the busy life of being a mum with two little ones and so forth. So that's all going to be there for you if you want to take a look at that and use it at any stage. So there's a bit of it there. So Friday prayer, more links to Heather and so forth. And on that note, it's probably enough for one session because there's a lot there. There's a lot for you to think about. It's a lot for you to go and explore further. And if there's anything that you're not sure of, maybe you can email Anthony Munro and he'll get in touch with me, perhaps. I just dobbed him in there. But thank you so much. I wish you peace. And in our combined work together, may this topic in particular help our students really, really grapple with their role in helping to develop a peaceful and harmonious, inclusive Australian society where everyone feels welcome and where no one is condemned because of their faith. Okay, so thank you. Go well.